Hello. Hello to everyone in the room at the Lethaby Gallery and also everyone who's joining our online audience. Thank you so much for coming today. So today is Forest School Talks, learning from the sacred forest. And later Gaia will be introducing our guests today. So Forest School Talks, well, let me introduce myself actually first. Yeah, my name is Joy. I am CSM alumni and also working with Andreas Lang on the Forest School program. I'll go through a little bit about what Forest School is. But yeah, that's who I am. So yeah, this talk is part of an ongoing series that has been happening over the last year, part of the Forest School Talks. And it's really like a series of talks that aims to connect and learn different practices, projects, and ideas that are embedded in learning from living systems, like the forest, so hence the name Forest School, and really, yeah, interrogating ways that we go about dealing with the climate and biodiversity crisis. So this is a kind of slide of previous events that have happened. So yeah, this program comes out of the Forest School. And this is like where you can access information about Forest School. But yeah, it's an MA architecture initiative that comes out of Central St. Martin's. And it's a growing network of collaborators and partners looking at how we readjust our relationship to planet Earth through the lens of the forest, which is like this entity, living thing that embodies like different ideas about how we relate to planet Earth. So yeah, as I speak to you, this is yeah, where you can find us online, forestschool.net. I think Andreas will post it in the group chat. So yeah, as I speak to you, we are standing in the Lethaby Gallery for everyone online. And we, at the moment, there's this exhibition that's Constructive Land. And this is led by Forest School, along with Material Cultures, supported by Forestry England and Derby Forest, and funded by the SOM Foundation. The research that you see in this room is really about how we relate to our landscape and how practices of architecture can become more regenerative instead of extractive in order to build our future in a decarbonized built environment. Alongside this exhibition space has also been a series of workshops and events that I've been helping to put together. So the space has really been activated by students and staff, like alongside from different programs. So for example, MA Regenerative Design was in here yesterday doing some steam bending. And it's really just, yeah, trying to activate the space and to be in dialogue with this research that is about how we change the way that we relate to the land. And it's really embodies ideas of experimentation and learning from different types of practices and projects that are, I don't know, not the typical thing that we kind of learn from. So I guess like in this context, Learning from the Fringe has been a studio that has come, that's a BA vertical studio that's come to also activate the space here. And they are in essence kind of hosting this lecture today. And so on that note, I'd like to hand over to them to introduce who is coming to speak today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joy, and welcome to everyone that is joining the talk, both on site in the Lethaby Gallery, as well as online. So welcome, everyone. It's really nice to have you all here this afternoon for the lunchtime talk series of Forest School. So it's a pleasure to be here, to be a resident with the Forest School in the Lethaby Gallery, and to kind of collaborate to really try and learn as much as we can from the forest. So today, as Joy kind of introduced, the forest talk is hosted by Learning from the Fringe, and we are one of the BA Architecture vertical studios, which is led by Carlotta Novella, sitting in front of me, and myself, Gaia Crocella, and is formed by a big chunk of these wonderful group of people that is sitting in front of us. A lovely group of architecture students from year 2 and 3. And as a studio, we are situated in Epping Forest, and we really departed from the forest as a site for learning, experimentation, knowledge creation, and sharing. So today we want to understand how we can learn from natural ecosystems, from their resilience, from their resourcefulness and generosity, to be able to reimagine our built environment in times of planetary emergency. And so the theme of today's session is learning from the sacred forest, as you all have read and know by now. And we have the immense pleasure to be joined by our 2, hopefully, wonderful guests today. Yes, Debojyoti is online, wonderful. So Debojyoti, I'll be handing over to you soon. But so we have the immense pleasure to be joined by these 2 incredible guests, who I will introduce shortly. And we have the social anthropologist, Dr Debojyoti Das, and the architect, educator, and practitioner, Anagh Bali, who is joining us on site. And they will guide us in the investigation, assimilation, and digestion of the knowledge embedded in the Asian sacred forests. So together we will discuss about how we can bring the teachings of the sacred forests to envision alternative ways to live and build with empathy towards any living system. So starting from the notion of sacred groves in Northeast India, Dr. Debojyoti Das will expound on how the advancement of missionary modernization, state intervention, and the expansion of monocrop plantations in the region has shifted the relationship between indigenous communities with their material landscape, the forest itself. And later on, from the northeastern highlands, Anagh Bali will take us to the southern part of India and the Indian Ocean to reach the Andaman and Nicobar archipelago. So to start the talk, we now welcome Dr. Debojyoti Das, who is an anthropologist of South Asia with a focus on the borderlands of Eastern India and the Indian Ocean. And his work is deeply interdisciplinary, bridging his training as an ethnographer with extensive use of visual media and oral sources. His current research focuses on climate change, natural disasters, migration, and sustainable development issues among marginalized littoral communities in the Sundarbans Delta. And his research interests really lie in transdisciplinary and community-focused work, which feeds into the use of different qualitative methods and tools for action research. So here we are. I'll stop sharing my screen, and we're very happy and pleased to welcome you, Debojyoti. Over to you. The floor is all yours.
So to start with, I would like to thank all of you for inviting me and also for the generous introduction. So today I'll be speaking about the relationship between forest and humans in the more than human spaces, particularly in the current context. We are talking about climate change, global warming, and the COP meeting is soon going to start in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. So it becomes very relevant for us to understand the relationship between humans and the more than human spaces. So for over more than a century, we have seen how scientists and kind of naturalists have looked into the relationship between humans and the kind of wider world, the ecological processes. But recently, environmental humanists, medical humanists, they have started to look about, to understand the relationship that humans have held for millennia. And I would say kind of thousands of years with the natural environment that has had significant transformation in the last over 150, 200 years with the Industrial Revolution. And we kind of understand this new era as a geological age where humans have had great ecological footprint. So we can see the agency of humans playing a more dominant role that emerges out of the Enlightenment philosophy that, there is a divide between man and nature, a Cartesian politics that has shaped our relationship with the natural world, which is not the case in indigenous society, in the global South communities where people are more close to nature and they have a convivial relationship built across, landscapes, whether it is the mountain landscape or is the coastal regime, or if you go to the tropical forest, you would see that the relationship is more than human. And every entity is given equal respect, although that might have diminished in the current capitalist era and the neoliberal era. But still we see people's relationship with their natural environment is more intimate, is more convivial, it's more collaboratory, it's more mutual than what we see in urban landscape. So the title of my talk today will be The Sacred Groves, shifting cultivation, which I'll be talking about, and its relationship with the natural environment. So before I go into my talk, I would like to I'll stop sharing here and I'll try to share it again because I had put it in the wrong mode. Okay, so it should be fine now. Let me share. Sorry. And portion of your screen. Yeah. So can you see my screen?
At the moment, we can only see half of it. So if
that's fine.
You drag it over,
I will put it.
Now it's zoomed in a bit too much. It may be best to instead just share the window and then make it full screen if you don't need to reference any notes.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Then...
Oh, that works how you've done it now. Oh wait, no, it's gone small again.
Okay, let me do something. Is it fine now?
No, we can only see. That's now good. Yes.
Is good?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, but then what I cannot see is my notes. So I'm not sure what has happened here. Let me share it again and I'll take a portion of the screen, share. No, it's not working in that way. What I have to do is stop sharing. Let me go to my file and see how it is organized. Currently, it is not organized in a very great way because I cannot see my notes. Let me end the show and get back to this. And okay, let me put the screen properly so that it comes into the, and
if you share it without it being full screen and then just select the portion of the screen that's the slides, that may work.
Okay, let me see. So portion of the screen, shall I advance? Yeah, portion of the screen and share. Yeah.
And then if you move the kind of box that you can see that's saying which portion is being shared to be just the Forest School talk, the actual slide itself.
Yeah,
that may be an option.
Yeah, this
one. So at the moment we can see the thumbnails and that's all. So if you kind of drag it to be
like this.
So if you drag it to be over the main slides, it's larger.
So is it okay? Is it this is fine?
Yeah, at the moment we can see the whole of the PowerPoint window. Okay,
so shall we do this way? No, something is not right.
Where are you looking at your notes from?
The notes are on the bottom, yeah.
Okay.
Because, yeah, this is the notes, but everybody can see it, right?
No, we can't see your notes at the moment, but we can see the rest of the PowerPoint window.
But that's fine. I think that's fine like this. Yeah.
Okay.
We can't see. Yeah, we can see enough. Yeah.
You see enough? Is it fine?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I don't know who's doing so, because I did another presentation yesterday. It didn't make this problem. Okay, so I'll be talking about the relationship between humans and forest, particularly in the context of Northeast India, where I did field work for nearly 14 months in 2009 when I was doing my PhD. But before going to that context, let me also tell you the story that in the global south, the discussions about nature, the kind of relationship that humans have built with nature, and the kind of violence people have seen living in the forest emerged in the late 18th century with the expansion of the British Empire and the forestry department that was created when the colonial state kind of decided to bring all the forest under, its control. So slowly people started losing their user-factory rights over land and forest, and that resulted in kind of conflicts, and that resulted not only in conflicts between humans and the government officials of the colonial state, but also the conflict between tiger and humans and other top carnivore and wildlife, and that resulted in the creation of new reserve forest. So there are two critical literature which have come out, and one of the literature I'm kind of referring to in relation to the second talk that will be done in the context of Andaman. But the first literature is this path-breaking book, which was published 2 decades ago by Ramachandra Guha and Madhav Gadgil, which is called The Fisherland. And then the second book that came out as Ecology and Equity. Both kind of highlighted the impact of colonialism and the post-colonial kind of nation states' impact on dividing the land between forested land and the non-forested land. But that is not the case in northeastern part of India, where most of the community elders and the community members own the land, and the state only has a kind of a role which is quite distant from what they have in other parts of mainland India. The second book, titled Above the Forest, is a very interesting kind of research that Vishwajit Pandya did. He is an anthropologist who has been trained in the United States and kind of is somewhat critical of the British anthropological tradition of how they looked at the Andamanis and in fact all native communities. But his work kind of looks at ethnomusicology, cosmology, and the power of rituals. So this book is a fascinating study of the changes that has come in indigenous life world of the Andamanese people since Radcliffe Brown, as some of you might know, the famous British anthropologist, published his monograph in 1922 titled The Andamani Islands, where he presented a very typical structural functionalist view of Andamanese people and their religious beliefs as collective aphorisms. It talks about the this book talks about the transformative changes in Andamanese society from an indigenous perspective. The book introduces the term cosmography, an indigenous Andamanese worldview, in order to make Orangi cosmology relevant to the wider world. So Orangs are one of the indigenous group in the Andaman Islands, and they are quite kind of endangered. Their language is endangered. The book clearly demonstrates indigenous Orangis' embedded relationship with the spirit world, which colonial anthropologists misinterpreted in very simplistic term by adopting a Cartesian logic of dividing nature from culture, rituals from beliefs, and lived experiences from cosmology. The book straddles between the natural and the spirit world of the forest. Therefore, it is to my understanding that we cannot separate nature from culture. Both are intertwined, embedded, and as anthropologist Tim Ingold would suggest, nested, and thus become particularly important when we are talking about conservation in today's global context. I will demonstrate this in the following slides, where I talk about my research among Sweden cultivators in Northeast India and ways missionary modernization and state intervention has transformed their livelihood and relationship with the forest. I will also focus on the sacred groves of Meghalaya, which is another state in the Northeast, and sacred groves are something quintessentially kind of disappearing across the globe as well as in South Asia because of new plantations, because of mining activities, and many other anthropogenic interventions which are not necessarily kind of helping the communities out, are rather kind of burdening them with more challenges. So to give a contextual geographical location of the study area, so Nagaland is a state of India which became a free, kind of state in 1961. Before that, it was part of the whole of Northeast, as you can see in this small map, the whole of Northeast India, which borders with China in the north, Myanmar in the east, and Bangladesh in the south. So I conducted my fieldwork in this part of Nagaland, which is around 290 kilometers from the capital town of Kohima, very close to the Myanmar border. The Chin Kachins, as you know, in Myanmar, in the highlands, they kind of occupy as neighbors with the Nagas. And Nagas have been kind of discredited with this term that they were the headhunters of the 19th century, and the British could not kind of control them much. In fact, these areas where I did field work, they remained uncontrolled till the 1947 when the British left. They were also considered as blind alien spaces where the British would only carry punitive expedition. They would only kind of have tributary alliances with these tribes. So they remained remote from the mainstream of the Indian subcontinent. Now, this is the village where I did field work. As you can see, there is a pristine greenery and there are kind of high mountains behind the village. This kind of is the new landscape, the landscape that was carved out of the natural environment in 1940s. So this settlement came up only in the 1940s. There was a feud between some villages in the neighborhood, and then the people who lost, they came and settled in this village. So in 1940, they were all Aminist believers. They were kind of, you can say, pagan believers. But by 1950s, the American Baptist missionaries entered this landscape. In fact, they had not come to this land before that time. And these new missionaries were actually the local indigenous converts there, because by 1947, the Indian government stopped Americans from coming to India. So the indigenized, the new Baptists who were baptized by the Americans before India's independence, they came to this land from the neighboring tribal areas, like from the Ao territory, from the Angami territory, to proselytize the population and to kind of make them modern, as we would call it. So that is one narrative that I'll draw in terms of understanding humans' relationship with the natural environment. And then if you go to and then the Indian state also played a very important role in kind of promoting, rice as the crop of civilization. Rice became the most important food, but that took many decades and kind of years to kind of realize, because it is also embedded, that food culture is also embedded in the social structure. So you have to actually destabilize the social structure before you can change their food habit. And you also kind of have to rethink the time. So I would also discuss about time discipline, how it has changed. Time reckoning, the almanacs that they used and they use currently are quite distinct from what it used to be in the past. This is a kind of, as we talk about biodiversity, this region of Northeast is the most biodiverse region in South Asia. It has got the highest number of biodiversity because these areas have not been kind of infiltrated by mining industry, have not been infiltrated by industries and other economic activities, secondary and tertiary. So they remain pristine. But what is interesting here is the different tribes and the different linguistic groups that you see. So as we see biodiversity, we also see linguistic and cultural diversity in this region overlapping. So the small state of Nagaland and Manipur and Assam kind of host more than a dozen linguistic groups and dozen ethnic groups. And they each carry their own symbols, their own customs, their own traditions, and they are all kind of aligned with this whole idea of, living in harmony with nature, which has changed over a period of time, no doubt. This is the classic map, the unoccupied territory that I kind of discovered in the British Library, which is not very far from your campus. So this was an expedition that was carried in 1936-37, where the colonial state was trying to expand the boundaries. As you can see, there is a gap between Assam and Burma. And in 1942, when the war broke out, the World War kind of entered, the Japanese forces were trying to occupy the northeastern part of India. This was the region which had the fiercest battle, the only battle, the Battle of Kohima, which took place in these areas, in these neighborhoods. So these remain the kind of frontiers of British Empire in South Asia. You can see the Assam Rifles military expedition to rescue slaves, and these areas also had slaves. So the often kind of, off-quoted term, slave rescue missions were carried out to kind of, relieve these areas from slave trade in as late as 1930s. But what I'm coming through is also the representation, how the Nagas were represented. So this is one of the pictures taken by one of the anthropologists who taught and studied at SOAS, and he was the head of the Department of Anthropology till 1980s. He kind of did pioneering fieldwork among the Imchungal Nagas and the Ao Nagas and the Konyak Nagas, in fact. And he kind of, represented the tribes that I studied in 2009 in this manner. So the colonial effort was to kind of delegitimize the Nagas' kind of identity, in the sense that they were considered as lazy, they were considered as drinking wine, they were considered drinking beer, they were not really productive, and they were not really kind of contributing to what modern societies would do. And their farming was often labeled as kind of, backward. And that continues till this date. And there is always as kind of, ideas for improvement, how they can improve. Now, coming to the current times and the current landscape that we see, when I was doing field work, you can see the development of paddy fields, and you can also see the remnants of shifting cultivation, which is still carried out in the highlands. So what people grow in the hills? So in the hills, people grow multiple crops. They grow millets, they grow buckwheat, they grow chilies, corn, long beans, vegetables. They have number of taboos. They cannot just go and clear the field. So shifting cultivation is a form of agriculture where people cultivate in a plot of land for 2 years, then they move to another place and they cultivate there for another 2-3 years, and then they move to another place. So it's a kind of rotational practice. So you cannot cultivate in one plot of land. So you have to be semi-nomadic, you have to migrate from one region to another. But over a period of time, what people have seen and highland communities have observed, that their population expand and shifting cultivation is no longer sustainable. So what they do, they find alternative forms of farming. So here we have seen in the bottom picture, people in the valleys where there used to be floods, annual floods, people have started growing rice. But then it didn't happen automatically. It didn't happen overnight. It took like 30 to 40 years for this transformation to happen. So when the missionaries came, they carried rice and they were consuming rice. And when they started preaching the local people about the gospel, they kind of promoted this whole idea that you should not take heads. You should not drink, you should not, make beer in your house. But then if you look at the crops like millets and buckwheat, they are the main crops which are used to produce wine. And the missionaries clearly came to every household and they said, you have to stop consuming wine. Initially, people kind of resented, they didn't agree to it. But when the village headman converted himself to Christianity, he also decided that I should observe these practices. And what dwindled out of this activity was the jenas, the kind of, taboos that they had. Like, for example, going into the forest, not cutting forest, or let's say consuming too much of firewood or collecting too much of firewood that would destroy the biodiversity. So those values slowly went down. People went to the church before a cropping season. They will go to the church. They will offer their, prayers, and then they would go to the field and cultivate. But that was not the case in the previous period before missionaries came in. They would go to the forest, they would sacrifice a chicken, and they would pray towards the God, saying that we should get a good harvest. And that is how the agriculture was run. And it was also run on the system of moon cycles. So if it's half moon, it's not a good time to sow the seed. If it's full moon, it's a good time to sow the seed. So crop cycles were determined by nature's, like we have the tidal system, which is connected with our, solar system, which is connected with the moon and the sun's position. The crop infestation is also determined by different seasons and the particular days of the month. So the local communities, the indigenous groups had good understanding of when to cultivate and when not to cultivate. But then in the 1950s and 60s, the state governments and the national government brought in new ideas. We had the World Bank introduced this Grow for Food program under the Ford Foundation kind of funding. And then from the mainland India, they were supplying seeds. They were supplying high yielding varieties of seed, which was developed during the Green Revolution. And this led to people people kind of coming into in contact with these seeds, and the government started giving subsidies. They started giving loans. They also started giving them money to develop irrigation. So all these infrastructures came together and kind of incentivized farmers to adopt new forms of farming. Now that was a decade of 1950s, 60s, 70s, when farmers tried to kind of innovate, but they didn't have enough labor force, because most of the clan members would go to the Sweden plots, and they would not now, sorry. Yeah. So they would go to the Sweden plots, and they would cultivate the crops. And the labor supply in the paddy field was very short. So not many paddy fields appeared. But what happened in the 1980s, the government started intensifying highland agriculture. So they introduced cash crops, they introduced plantations, they introduced horticultural crops. That resulted in new subsidies, new self-help groups were formed, and that kind of triggered a change in the landscape. And as you can see here in the next photograph, people are still kind of cultivating using very rudimentary technology. I would say they're using traction plow, but that traction plow is quite distinct. You can see there is a iron hoe that is being used, not necessarily a bullock cart kind of tilling the land using wooden plow. So that is the difference. And you can see how people are clearing the forest. So that is also quite distinct and different from how you would see it in other contexts. So we can see that there has been kind of fundamental change in how people do their farming and how agriculture has changed. So this is how paddy is cultivated now in the study village. And all of these people are kind of recruited by the church. So the church came up in the village in the 1970s, and it started creating new committees. So they had this young Bible group, they had this citizen group, they created new kind of, labor unions. So all of these labor unions had to at least give 1 day of free labor in a month. And that was considered as something that they would gift to the church, to the Baptist church. And that is how they created this whole workforce who would contribute towards growing rice. So the ethos of living with nature changed over time as missionaries inculcated new values. And I would say that they were like kind of more invested in this whole idea that people should kind of spend their time more efficiently. So that was another kind of way in which the missionaries kind of transformed the landscape. But
sorry, Debojyoti, apologies, just a quick warning that we'll have 2 more minutes and then we'll move on.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so then we also see the change in the teak and the plantation, the other plantation, the elder-based plantation that became very popular in the 1980s, 1990s, in 2000. And we can see that the change has been remarkable in terms of how it has transformed the whole landscape. So when I was doing field work in that area, I saw conservation workers coming to the area with GPS, and they were doing bird watching. They were trying to identify birds which have not been seen in the past. So that was another kind of activity that they were carrying out. And you can see the host variety of new crops that have been introduced. That is also leading to soil erosion. That is also leading to, kind of acidification of soil and desertification in these landscapes. They've also started growing biodiesel crop, which has been supplied by the government. But if you can see the food basket of the village, you can see that people are growing oats, they're growing job tears, they're growing rice, they're growing maize. But when you look at what people are consuming these days, they're just consuming rice, and they're just consuming some vegetables and dry meat. So that has also affected their health, because many people are now suffering from diabetes. The cases of diabetes have increased, and the church has played a very important role in this endeavor. So I'll quickly go to the next slide, which will be perhaps my last slide. So if you look at this slide, the sacred groves of Meghalaya, which I wanted to discuss, but because of the lack of time, I will not be able to discuss that now. So the sacred groves have a very important role to play in society. They are not just economic resources. So sacred groves are tracts of virgin forests that have cultural and spiritual significance for the people who live around them. They have been protected by communities around the world for a variety of reasons, including religious beliefs, burial grounds, and watershed values. As a result of this rich biodiversity of these forests are protected. In Meghalaya, sacred groves represent a long tradition of environmental conservation based on indigenous knowledge by the tribal communities. They are among the few least disturbed forest patches which are serving as the natural treasure house of biodiversity and a refuge of a large number of endemic, endangered, and rare taxa. So at least in Meghalaya, there are 50 endangered plant species which have been identified within these sacred groves, and people don't kind of disturb them. So I'll come to the last slide now. So what have we learned from these case studies? What is the relationship between humans and their more than human environment? So one thing that I would like to highlight is the mutualistic relationship between humans and their natural environment. And these relationships are very embedded in their cultural practices, in their festivals, in their rituals. So we must look at the human-nature relationship from a multi-species ethnographic lens, rather than just looking at human as the dominant, species in this relationship. Because of changing morals, values, and beliefs, this has transformed the relationship that humans have had with their forest world. Forests are also about people, and this is very important when we are decolonizing the discipline, that we need to understand that humans live with the natural environment. So we cannot just think about conservation in situ without thinking about the wider landscape. And finally, in indigenous culture, the survival of community depends on interdependence and respect for the natural world as a living system. So to conclude, I would like you, if you want to know more about this story and the kind of ethnography that I did, you should read my book. The title of the book is called The Politics of Sweden Farming, Environment and Development in Eastern India. With this, I will conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Debojyoti. Thank you very much for such a rich introduction to the sacred forest. It was really wonderful listening to you, and I would suggest that we'll hold for questions for a moment and combine questions at the end of the talk, unless there is any very immediate and urgent question for Debojyoti. Well, thank you to this incredible introduction, and we are ready now to move from the northeastern highlands to dive into the Indian Ocean and to reach the Andaman and Nicobar archipelago, where Anagh Bali will expound on his research into the indigenous architecture of the Nicobarese people. And really, he will kind of let us understand how their relationship to local ecosystems guides the creation and evolution of their settlements. Anagh is an architect, educator, and practitioner specializing in the application of vernacular knowledge through natural and repurposed materials in contemporary construction. He's studied and worked with vernacular and traditional architecture in a number of regions in India, and his fascination really lies in the resilience and evolution of indigenous architecture in the Nicobar Islands. Through projects in India and the work with Bamburu in Thailand, he has explored a design-build approach that brings together local natural materials with modern industrial solutions. So we are ready to welcome Anagh now. The floor is all yours. I'll just share the screen and welcome you to the lessons from Nicobar. Let me know if you see this.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Gaia. Thank you so much. Also to the Forest School, everybody at CSM for organizing this. So happy to be here and have so many people watching today. So yeah, I think we're running a bit late, so I'm going to jump right in. The Nicobar Islands, I don't know if many of you know, They form the southern group of the Andaman and Nicobar archipelago, and they're about a group of 12 islands. All but one of them are inhabited by the indigenous people there. Saying that, as Debojyoti was mentioning about the northeast of India, there is tons of diversity within the cultures, languages, dialects, etc. The Nicobar Islands are protected tribal land, which means that people from outside usually can't go there. But saying that, again, another parallel to Debojyoti's presentation would be that since the 1900s and the, how would you say, the forced entry of the missionaries as well as the Indian government, to be honest, there have been a lot of changes to the culture, to the way they look at their land, to the religion, as well as to the way they build. I'm going to try and avoid all of those things and stick towards what the traditional architecture of the Nicobaris people teaches us. So I was lucky enough to have a chance to go there because I'd made a few friends who lived there, and that was pretty much my gateway into the Nicobar Islands. So when I was doing my thesis, I was really excited to be able to visit the village of Munnak. Munnak is, I would say, one of the few villages that still retains most of the traditional character. I think this view of the village when you access it by boat, which is the only way you can, is a kind of good representation of the fragility and beauty of the context that they build in and live in. They occupy this thin slice sandwiched between the tropical rainforests and the sea. Taking another more, I would say, architectural cross-sectional look at this. So on the one hand, you have the sea, which is kind of the primary means of transport, of going to other islands, meeting people from other communities, and also from where people from other places come to them, and all the fish and all the food, I would say, in some ways. On the other hand, you have the rainforests in the back. The Nicobaris people do not have the idea of sacred groves, but rather the entire forest is considered to be sacred. It is what they consider as the realm of the spirits. So their relationship with how they perceive the resources they require from the forest is strongly guided by their belief systems and their traditional rituals, which again, like the change of religion has affected to some extent, but I think it was really fascinating for me to see that there were a lot of continuities in their old beliefs, which still helps them retain that respect for the rainforests. Right in between, they have the zone where they actually grow what they grow and build what they build. Just to give another perspective, once you're in the village, this is pretty much what the front of the village looks like. You're right at the edge of the water. It's under your feet at high tide, which makes it really important for them to understand how climate is changing, how the weather is changing, and keeping a track of that. So what you see here are actually some form of traditional meteorological devices. It helps them monitor the prevalent wind directions, which gives them, since they have deeper vernacular knowledge of these things, an understanding of coming storms, of weather changes, of season changes, and when the monsoon is going to hit. So yeah, again, some great vernacular wisdom there right as soon as you step into the village. So one of the important things, or one of the primary things that I realized about the Nicobaris way of, the Nicobaris way of, rather their relationship to their local context and the ecosystem, is that it is strongly guided by a very different relationship within the community and the ideas of privacy and community and what role your village and your people play, both in creating your architecture as well as deciding on things which we'll slowly get to. one by one. So to talk more about that, we're going to use, I'm sorry, this sunlight has decided to hit the screen right now. But what we are going to use as an example to look at all of these things is the roundhouse, which is called the Nihupul, which is an interesting building because it is the home of the leader of the village, which in this case was Captain Cecilia Adams, who was gracious enough to have us there for a few weeks. You can see her laughing in the background, enjoying an afternoon with family and friends. But at the same time, the Nihupul is also the primary public space or the community space of the village. So the Nihupul functions as, let's say, a gathering space for all kinds of reasons, one of which is village meetings, for example, when things need to be decided. So all of these things are hints that you kind of see already in the design of the space. It's very open, it's circular, it's democratic, it has multiple accesses and axes. And for different kinds of functions, there's a more formal entrance that you have facing the sea where guests from other villages arrive. There is the village entrance from where your neighbors and your community has access to the roundhouse. And then because it is also a house, there is an entrance for the family themselves towards their kitchens and the rest of the house. One more function it plays is that of ceremonial space. So what you see here are some idols. They represent the ancestors of the Nicobarese people. In fact, what I was told that they have pieces of ancestors inside them, which is quite interesting. And even though most people here are Christian, they continue to stick strongly to their traditional systems, which is interesting. And most ceremonies, again, happen in the Nihupul. With everybody in there, and it turns into a party of sorts quite frequently, I must say. Looking at the Nihupul as a space, you can understand how it creates an open platform for the community above. But at the same time, the way that they necessarily have to build, being at the edge of the sea, it creates a space to park your boats, and it also automatically creates a home for the other members of the community. So all the livestock, the goats, the chickens, the dogs, they all live under the houses. And very interestingly, they say that the gaps in the floorboards are designed for the food to drop through so that the chickens can eat. But when you don't have enough food dropping through, the chickens will walk in as well. Going further, the role of community in building is central. The idea of self-build, I think, is very well established. Everybody makes their own homes. The rest of the community helps them build those homes. Whenever a family, let's say, needs to build a new house, they would first have a meeting with the village elders and the rest of the community. And through these meetings, the resources are allocated and the land is allocated. So the idea of democratic processes kind of stays. Continues even into the building of homes for individual people. That I found very fascinating and kind of very different from what we are usually used to, not coming from that kind of a culture, at least I was. Yeah, and everybody has a role to play, from the kids to the elders. You know, the materials are procured locally, they're processed locally, and everything is made together as a collective venture. Talking about materials, I think this was an important part of why I think I'm here to talk in the forest school. So the resources that we extract from the forest, I think this got stuck.
Can you try? Oh, now that's moving.
It's moving by mouse now, so we'll stick to that. So the resources, again, it's really interesting because the Nicobaris live and build in a very rich tropical ecosystem, and they have very dense, rich forests all around them. But at the same time, the selection of the materials and the quantities in which they are extracted is very closely linked to not just what they would be used for, but rather also what their growth cycles are, and what role they play in the larger forest system. So you would find that even though there's plenty of trees, materials like hardwood would be not so commonly used because they understand that trees take a long time to grow. So the bulk of what they build with is actually stuff that they grow in the plantations themselves, or stuff that grows very fast in the edges of the forest. So considering that, the bulk of the construction is done with things like bamboo, different kinds of cane, a lot of thatch from palm trees, areca nut wood, coconut wood, and all kinds of fast growing, easy growing materials that they also have in the plantations. And materials like hardwood then are reserved for one, more respectfully treated in the way they are also ornamentally carved and presented, but also reserved for functions which where their durability and value becomes more necessary. So this kind of rationing of different kinds of resources that you can get from the forest was very interesting to see, that it's not just based on what we need, but also based on what the life cycle of the of the material itself is. Oh, sorry, I keep clicking the arrow, but the slide doesn't change. Finally, moving on to the idea of resilience. I could have jumped on it earlier, but as you can see, being in this kind of precarious situation, ideas of longevity and survival are very different in the Nicobaris way of building. And it's more of a ship of Theseus kind of situation where resilience is achieved through adaptability, removability, replaceability. So this house you actually see is used to be a few hundred meters out in the sea. And during an earthquake in 2008, the sea levels rise by about 1.5 meters, which made it practically unusable for a lot of reasons. And it was pretty much dismantled and moved back as is, and continues to have the same roof and same wood and same everything. And these kind of adaptable processes are made possible by the details and the ways that they build. The foundations, for example, as you can see here towards the left side of the slide, are kind of designed in a tapered way rather than spreading out, which structurally seems not intuitive, but it allows you to pull out members directly from the ground very easily whenever you need to replace something or move something. And everything else within the construction has a great deal of knowledge of balance and structure, and so it only requires either tying down or nothing at all, and things are just rested on each other, which again is I think pretty masterful of them, not depending on glues and tacks and nails and screws to make fascinating things. So yeah, considering all of this, I quickly wanted to take you guys through some questions, and quickly, if I have the time, maybe through some projects that I did where maybe I understood some things and tried to do them, and maybe I didn't, so we can also talk about that. So how I won't read these questions for you, sorry, they're right there. So yeah, these were some important questions that came up because practicing as a designer, you do not have vernacular knowledge everywhere you work within yourself. You do not have often a very good understanding of what resources are available and might be best used. And in some cases, you do not know what is going to happen to what you design over time. So the first project is this little house that we built in Deccan, India. This is near Bangalore, right at the edge of the Kaveri Forest Reserve. Again, the house basically, why we called it the house on the hillside, we were debating also calling it the house from the hillside. The idea behind it was to create something that kind of sinks in or disappears into the landscape, and which kind of inspired us to build it from whatever we found in the landscape. So everything in the house was built using stuff that we had on site. Everything was excavated by ourselves. We got the stone out of the ground, we dug the earth, which left a big hole, and in that hole we treated the bamboo that we used for the roofs, which was harvested locally as well. Everything was processed, prepared, built on site, and that still left this question of windows and doors because we didn't have them growing at site. So what we found a solution for was to rescue a lot of doors and windows from towns and villages around. And in doing that, we had about 25 different sized and different shaped doors and windows in this house, which I think kind of works for it. And in the end, we kind of felt happy that we managed to achieve something that was born of a place and seemed like it belonged there, even though it didn't look anything like the architecture you find there right now. Another one quickly, I think if I can get 30 more seconds, is this project which had more to do with community than with forests and materials, maybe to do with materials as well a little bit. It was a small project for a little classroom. It was the agriculture field lab for a rural school outside of Hyderabad, also in Deccan, India. The project was basically designed on site and built by all of us together. And the idea behind it was to rather involve the teachers and the students in the making of this classroom in the field that they had just been granted to conduct a course on agriculture. So what we did was a series of workshops where we understood more about the soil they had, what else they could find around the farms, and how we could mix everything to make it work as a building material, which included cow dung, actually, which works really well. So through the process of the workshops, the kids got a chance to make lots of adobe bricks and play with mud and with soil and with sand and jump inside it and throw it around, and make thousands and thousands of blocks, many of which just broke by themselves, but they all had signatures on them from their respective makers. All of these went onto rather a plinth that the school had given us, kind of subtly telling us this is how much you can build and how it should be shaped. And so the whole time, the challenge for us was to kind of be more playful about what we're doing. Again, I never think about doors and windows, so same problem this time. How do we make the doors and windows? We found some gutter pipes. They're precast concrete gutters that you find. They're used for rainwater drains around rural India a lot. So we cut them up and we use them for some windows, and then these horrid concrete slabs that they used to make boundary walls in the back, we used for some other beams for some more panoramic views as well. And I think by the end of it, everybody was pretty happy with not having a box, but not the most terrible box. And most importantly, I feel like, yeah, even though it was a mishmash of all kinds of stuff, the process really taught us to share through building and learn a lot, like about cow dung, for example. Most importantly, I think it brought everyone together and we had a good time making the classroom. And I have overshot my time.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you both very much. Thank you, Anagh, and thank you, Debojyoti. We, of course, are running out of time. It's 14:34, so I understand if you need to leave, but it would be wonderful to just open the floor to a few questions. So if you're patient and have time, please stay for a couple of more minutes. So yes, please feel free to unmute yourself if you have questions online. And if you rather have questions from the audience, please raise your hand and I'll come with the mic. Or you can also type your question in the chat and I'll be happy to read it up loud. Yes, we have a question here, so I'll just pass the mic. Be patient, you won't see us in this very moment. What's your name?
Sure. My question is about Adobe Bricks. Did you fire it or did you try it?
I think we have only one mic. Yeah, thanks. I think the question was, yeah, it's a good question. I was running short of time, so I think I speeded through that. The Adobe bricks were just sun-dried. So we used a lot of cow dung, which is a good binding agent. It helps you reduce the amount of clay because otherwise the water gets stuck inside. And a lot of husk, rice husk, and sand, and just dried them out. But also because there was hundreds of kids coming in every day, building one brick each, we had an overload of bricks, but luckily we had a whole field to dry them. So the drying process kind of gave us that time to, keep checking everything is fine before we have to finally use it. But yeah, sorry. That's a hard one. I remember I wrote it somewhere. It's mostly sand. I think it's 70% sand. I would say 10 to 20% clay, and then 5% each of husk and cow dung. Yeah. And water too, but not so much water that it feels loose. So it's actually pretty hard to mix, which is why you saw it kind of feels wrong to show those images now, but the little kids struggling to mix it. So they had to jump on it together because it's pretty tight as a mix. We don't want it to be loose. Otherwise the excess water makes the brick shrink too much once it dries. So, cameras on that side.
Thank you, Anagh. Carlotta?
Hello. I have a question. I don't know if this mic works, but I have a question for, I guess, both Debojyoti and Anagh. Related to, there was some point in both your lectures where you but mentioned in one sense the moon cycles and setting the kind of like rhythmical sowing and harvesting of different crops. And in your case, it was the water tides, or like, let's say the water going up and down. And this notion of like, let's say two things that are not controlled by humans, setting the scene for what humans will do, either will be able to use in a way or unuse. So I guess perhaps what I put in my notes was this notion of control and how much lack of control is actually something to embrace in these territories. I don't know who wants to answer. Debojyoti, maybe, and then.
I think it's a wonderful question that you have raised, and this whole notion of control, we can read through Foucault and kind of see how the biopolitics works in our life. Like we kind of try to control nature in ways that we kind of destabilize the perception of how we should live with it. So I think the indigenous communities have got very grounded understanding, tacit understanding of their environment, and they don't necessarily control nature. They are kind of live with nature mutually. And that's the beauty of how indigenous societies have built their knowledge systems over a period of time. And we do recognize that indigenous knowledge is not perfect. We are not saying that that is the penultimate way of knowing the other worlds, but it's a way of understanding the problems that we are currently facing on a planetary scale. So if we are to kind of really go back to what we are expecting, 1.5 degrees temperature, we really need to understand how indigenous societies or indigenous communities or even village communities have kind of used resources in ways that kind of makes them or allows them to live convivially with the environment.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. I was also thinking about how, as you mentioned, Carlotta, like the idea of control as fighting against something, as opposed to the idea of control as understanding, is I think the difference here. And instead of going for more how would you say, trying to fight back against such things by building massive walls and stuff like this, it's rather this system of being more in tune with what is happening and having systems embedded to be able to adapt to it and to be able to change with things outside your control. I think is a very important lesson from both of these contexts, I would say. Yeah.
We have a question from the Zoom chat, if you want to go to that, or do you want to go to the room first?
No, sounds good. I was just reading it. Lucy, would you like to read your question? Or I can read it. Do you think cow dung could be used as a building material more widely? Or was it more a case of using the material because it was local?
Very good question. So in terms of cow dung as the building material itself, Lucy, I'm not so I mean, I don't know if it's used as a material more than as a binding agent. The traditional knowledge in that process, again, sorry, I skipped through all of that, is that it is used as an insecticide, or rather, how would you say, as a infestation preventive material, which is surprising because we usually associate cow dung with flies and fleas and all sorts, but that's only when it's dry, when it's wet. So they kind of say that you should dry the cow dung really well, and then it prevents infestations and termites from growing in so easily. So it has some kind of antibacterial properties, but to be honest, I've always been skeptical of that. I think that has a lot to do with what the cows are getting to eat. And if you're talking about cows in a mass farm being given injected antibiotics and all kinds of stuff, and I don't know, eating each other's meat, sometimes it happens, I guess, is not exactly the same as a cow that is eating the plants and herbs that it was supposed to be eating, roaming in a field, and thus its digestion and thus the dung. So, but yeah, interesting question. Maybe that's something to experiment with. Just try to reduce the soil and use more of the dung. I would still be concerned with the fact that it's mostly fiber. So maybe not structurally, but looking at some of the examples in the exhibition here, I can definitely imagine it being a very useful insulation material of some sort. But yeah, thank you for that question.
Yes, there is another question. Again, Andreas, do you want to read your question, or I can go ahead?
Hello, I can read it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk, both of you. It's been real enjoyable. I'm curious to understand how the increasing kind of stresses of climate change meet these practices, and how, because they seem incredibly agile and resilient, but I don't know if there's a limit to this, and how if they've already kind of reached capacity, and where if they see it as a point of crisis, or whether it seems quite natural in a way to adapt.
I think it is increasingly true. I think Andreas, you've asked a very interesting question. It's increasingly true that local communities are now skeptical about the environment because they are not very knowledgeable of when the rains would come and when there will be snowfall or thunderstorm, because the weather has changed quite dramatically. But what I have seen in my fieldwork in other parts of India, for example, in the Majuli River Island, which is based in the Brahmaputra River Basin, one of the biggest river island in the whole of Asia, people have built stilted houses, particularly the Mishing community, who are an indigenous group in this island, and they survived the floods. They live with floods. So technological measures like building embankment and then culverts and all these kind of, techno-managerial approaches have failed, but they have lived with floods for the past 100 years in modern times, and even before 100 of years back when they first came to settle this island. And these practices we can also see in Andaman, where they're using local materials, like they're using cane, they're using bamboo, as Anagh mentioned. They're also using kind of, betel nut tree barks and coconut tree, which are not necessarily very good wood for, building furnitures. So people know what to use where, because which is locally available and which also kind of can be built quickly and sustainable. So I think people are very much aware, the communities are very much aware what they use, but at the same time, they're skeptical. What I have seen in my recent fieldwork, particularly in the Bay of Bengal region, the people are not very certain what is going to happen to their lives. And many of these communities who live at the margins and are in the forefront of experiencing climate change impacts, they're actually migrating out of their natal homes.
If I can also chip in a little bit, I think I think that's yeah, that is a really good question. I think not just in the face of climate change itself, but I feel also in general, at least in Nicobar, what I observed was that this there's a kind of stress related to the changing world as a whole, or rather a changing worldview. And maybe in that situation, it might also be because a lot of this resilience and understanding is closely linked to their belief systems. And a disintegration of the belief systems means in some ways that all can be lost, or rather why live here anyways, or why live this way. And there are communities in the Nicobars which don't anymore live by the seaside after the tsunami, because most of their villages were completely wiped out. They were relocated by the government in emergency shelters much further inland and uphill, and they just continued to stay there. And you can tell when you travel there that the lifestyle they have now is very different from the lifestyle that a village like Munak would still have, being by the sea. They need to purchase scooters and automobiles, and it's no longer boats. They're having a lot more red meat. It's no longer fish. There's a lot of changes that automatically come along with that. So in terms of the limits of resilience, I would say that maybe it is maybe it is more than a physical resilience and retention, but it's rather the adaptation of the community and culture in itself that it eventually would transform into when it is beyond the scope of just material solutions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes, we have two more questions here in the audience. I'll just pass the microphone. Please say your name.
Hi, I'm Maulin from BARC Vertical Studio, so Learning from the Fringe. Thank you both for such an interesting and inspiring talk. There was something that Anagh said earlier that when you talked about one of the projects, you said something that the house was something that was born from a place. And so this is a question to the both of you. So do you think all projects should be something that borns from a place? should them be that way, and can we actually achieve that?
I'm sorry. Professor Debojyoti, would you like to go first?
Yeah, okay. So I don't think that's the case. It all depends on your experience with the lived environment, and that defines or shapes your understanding of the natural world. So it may be even urban space where you kind of develop your ideas. Like, for example, you are looking at algal bloom in a lake in a completely urban setting. So I don't think that's important. What is important is your perspective and where do you get that insight. It can also be in your living room that you get an insight. So you do need to go to the natural environment and explore, but you don't necessarily have to go to an exotic place where nobody has gone, or let's say it has been under-researched, as we did in the context of Andaman, Nicobar Islands, and in Northeast. You can go to, let's say, a city, let's say Karachi, and kind of do very interesting observations. So I don't think it is very important to have that, grounding. What is important is it should be driven by your interest, it should be driven by your intuition, and it should be driven by your lived experience.
Yeah, I totally agree. Also, maybe I mean to dig deeper into that statement now that I realize that I said that. I think in some ways I meant born from a place or of a place in the sense of its physicality, its resource and its material. Whereas in the case of that project itself, you can say that maybe in terms of concepts and ideas, it was not also born in that place. So I think, as Professor Debojyoti said, like assimilating knowledge and ideas from different places and from a context itself in order to be able to best address it and create something that could fit into a place rather than necessarily be just born from it is a more is a broader way of looking at that, because not it's not always necessary or right or important to extract everything from a place, and there might not be everything you're looking to do in a place ready to be extracted, or it might be outside of your reach, whether it is knowledge or material or anything else. So I think it always has to be, I mean, we've gone through indigenous local living in towards industrialization, and now we're moving into a post-modern, post-everything era. So it still has to be a process of transformation that is applicable to today, and not something that is forcibly trying to bring back a fixed idea from a specific time or place, I think.
Wonderful. We have one more question, right? Let me just move this around, and here you go.
Hi, my name is Prada, and then basically one of our studio site is like the brief is decolonizing climate too, so it touches on this a lot. And then our site is actually in Shadwell Basin, which is like an urban environment. And then I was kind of wondering, how do we apply the indigenous craft into such an urban landscape, and then how do we like assimilate that kind of culture? And I think it's kind of like playing with that. So I think kind of like I was kind of curious, from like, what do you guys think of that, like, you know, the brief itself too?
Great question. Who would like to respond first?
Anagh, you want to go?
All right. That's a tough one. If you're looking for us to give you a project proposal, that's not going to happen here. I think, again, some things I think might sound similar to what we were just talking to Maulin. You know, it doesn't, maybe I'm saying that because I don't know about the indigenous culture and history of this island, right? I might have studied it on another island, but there is something that was here maybe longer back than we can imagine. But there was a culture, there was a way of, I think you can still see it in parts of the United Kingdom. So I'm sure there is a post-industrial history to Shadwell Basin. I'm not saying specifically somebody was living there. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. But so there would be things that you could learn from that. But obviously, considering what it has been for the past few hundred years and what it has become now, you would have to account for a more recent vernacular history as well. I think like that, I think that's where the idea of involving community really comes, right? It's not just about having people to help you make bricks, but it's also about having people who know different aspects and layers to a place. Because they belong to that place, their families belong to that place, and I think that, you know, a kind of amalgamation of these few things could be a good way to approach such a project. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree with Anurag in great ways in how he explained the thing. I think what we need to do, like in this kind of very specific context, when you're talking about the urban landscape, it's very difficult to kind of engage with the oral history of the place, because people might have lost the tradition of transmitting knowledge orally. Perhaps we can look at the archives and kind of go back into deep time and history, try to understand how people kind of lived before the Industrial Revolution, and kind of bring out snippets from those histories and recreate an artificial kind of diorama or a model. I can think on those lines. Or if you look at the literature and go into the historical past, that might bring in some reflection. Or you can also look at the archaeological remains, or if there are any, or some kind of historical sites. These are the things that I can kind of imagine that would bring back the past to the present.
Thank you. Wonderful. Unless there is any other question online, I would say that the forest talk today, learning from the sacred forest, has come to an end. And we, as the Learning from the Fringe studio, would like to thank you both very much, both Dr. Debojyoti and Anagh Bali, for joining us today. I think your input was incredibly rich and fundamental for us to understand and kind of rethink the way we build and the way we live. So thank you both very much, and thank you to the Forest School for hosting us today.
Thank you. I thank everybody for attending, and I apologize for the delay that happened in joining. There was some confusion, yeah.
No worries at all. Apologies from us as well. I think technology is always a bit of a try out and test out. So thank you, Debojyoti. Thank you, Anna. Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye. Thanks again.